Biking in the winter is easy, they said. There's no bad weather, only bad clothing, they said. Last month, something very unique happened in the history of cycling in Montreal. Bike lanes that typically see enormous streams of cyclists in the summer and pretty decent numbers in the winter recorded days with 0 cyclists for the first time ever. How in the world does that happen? 2 substantial back-to-back snowstorms brought Montreal's largest 4-day snowfall on record, overwhelming its usually solid snow maintenance and forcing tough prioritization choices in a cleanup that took 2 weeks. The entire bike network basically shut down, and people still somehow found a way to complain about cyclists and bike lanes being prioritized. Storm number 1 on Thursday made cycling messy and unpredictable. The bike network does get plowed as snow falls, some boroughs better than others, but during bigger storms you'll still have to bike through some accumulation, and sometimes fall back to riding on the road or walking on the sidewalk. The next day, things began returning to normal. Painted bike lanes vanished under the snow, shrinking the bike network, but the main separated routes were much better, albeit narrowed by snowbanks. Winter is a stress test for a bike network. The best routes can hold up, but others buckle. Then on Sunday, an even bigger storm hit, and things got crazy. The city was already packed with snow, and it just kept piling up. Here's one of Montreal's busiest bike routes completely buried. Some people tried to bike, but it clearly wasn't working. Even walking was pretty tough, and many turned to skis or snowshoes instead. This municipal pickup truck made a valiant effort but was straining to plow the bike lane, pushing enormous amounts of snow around but still not getting close to creating a bare surface. The bike lane basically turned into a wider sidewalk for parents with sleds, which is fine. On days like this, it feels like you live in 2 different cities. The wind-swept, snow-filled streets are a world away from the lively summer neighborhoods that people visit Montreal for. There's a car buried here, a bike under there. This driver had to get out and dig after a snowplow trapped them in. On Monday, the city woke up buried in snow, 75 centimeters or 30 inches in just 4 days. Not that far off the average yearly snowfall in Chicago or Stockholm packed into one long weekend. Montreal is used to getting a lot of snow, but this was just too much. Snowplows struggled to even push through, and there was nowhere left to even put the snow. At some point, they had to mostly give up on plowing snow around, and switch to the slower but more effective snow removal process that actually picks up snow and trucks it out of neighborhoods, which I'll explain more later. I posted on social media about the bravery of post-storm cyclists and got some pushback, mainly from people in other cities. Cycling isn't brave, it's just transportation. There's no bad weather, only bad clothing. Okay, usually I'm with you guys on this, but trust me. Here's Montreal's busiest bike corridor. Here's another main bike lane. And here's bike share, all completely buried and unusable. Cycling wasn't literally impossible, but the whole bike network was basically out of service. The bike network was the most disrupted, but things were tough for everyone. Emergency and bus routes were plowed, including usually their sidewalks and bus stops, but most everything else was left for snow removal. Walking down a residential street meant trudging through deep snow that gradually got packed into uneven, winding pathways. Obstacles and narrow sections on bus routes meant that bus schedules were, let's say, semi-reliable. Car drivers faced problems like messy residential streets, parking, and of course digging out their buried cars at the beginning. Even as normally enthusiastic winter cyclists were forced to leave their bikes at home for a few days to a week or more, the anti-cycling crowd, journalists, politicians, and randoms on social media, still managed to complain that bike lanes were somehow being prioritized. This isn't true in a normal storm, pause the video to read the longer explanation, but it was definitely not true after the recent snowstravaganza. Bike lanes turned into snow dumps even as adjacent main roads were nice and clear. Sidewalks were often bad, but usually better than nearby bike lanes. This sidewalk isn't great, it's more messy than the road, but it's better than the adjacent bike lanes buried under these mountains of snow. Same story here, the snow in this bike lane is taller than the average cyclist. This sidewalk is worse than the road, but better than the bike lane. This sidewalk is narrow but usable, while the bike lane is beyond impossible to use, you couldn't even ski on it. Now, I can't pretend to have surveyed all the bike lanes in the city, in part because I couldn't really bike anywhere. But these are some of the most used bike corridors and the most bike-friendly boroughs buried under mountains of snow. Most of the city's busiest bike counters recorded 0 cyclists for the first time ever because they were literally impassable for up to 11 days. Here's my experience biking on one main route 11 days after the second storm, only to find a wall of ice. To be clear, I'm actually not criticizing the city for neglecting bike lanes. I don't love it, but I get it. This was an extreme snowfall where plowing was abnormally difficult. Prioritizing bus and emergency routes and then switching over to snow removal was understandable. I care more about bike lanes staying usable during and after the normal snowstorms that we get every year, and they generally do, with some variation between boroughs. What I won't accept, though, is people turning the truth on its head, claiming or suggesting that bike lanes were prioritized when they clearly weren't. Many commentators hid behind, well, I'm not saying it's the case, I'm saying there's a perception.
La perception, c'est que vous priorisez les vélos au lieu des piétons.
C'est la perception.
Exactement.
Ouais.
C'est la perception.
That's manipulative, fueling unnecessary division between pedestrians and cyclists. This mayoral candidate complained that city workers using snowblowers on bike share stations should have instead been helping seniors clear off their properties. But these weren't generic city workers, they were workers and contractors for the bike share company Bixie. Bixie is owned by the city, but their job is the bike share system. The private contractors have, a contract to clear off bike share stations. In times like this, it feels like any amount of support, attention, money, or space for cycling sparks claims of unfair privilege. The only way to avoid the perception is to eliminate bikes entirely.
La perception.
C'est la perception.
Fortunately, things started getting better for everyone. Soon after the storm, they started on the city's much more thorough snow removal operation, which sends dozens of teams of plows, trucks, and industrial snowblowers around the city to collect snow from each street and send it away to snow melting sites like this one and enormous snow dumps like this one, which is 10 stories high and has basically a constant stream of dump trucks and tractor trailers arriving and departing. Normally, snow removal happens a few times each winter and takes 5 or 6 days, but this time there was so much snow that they had to make multiple passes of each street. The process took 2 weeks total and had crews working night and day. Near the end, as I was filming, one of the workers said to me, "Le cauchemar est presque terminé." The nightmare is almost over, referring probably to how hard they had to work as well as the lack of mobility that residents experienced in the aftermath of the storm. The slower progress meant that nearby streets or even different sides of the same street could often be in wildly different conditions, leading, for example, to one-way bike lanes handling both directions. But the results were really impressive. Watch this buried bike lane reappear. This unusable bike lane becomes rideable again. Here's a sidewalk by a daycare before and after. Snow removal after bigger storms is a reason why Montreal as a dense city is able to keep its bike lanes pretty clear, not to mention its sidewalks and of course on-street parking for drivers. 2 weeks of impressive effort from city workers gradually gave us back our bike lanes, sidewalks, and residential streets. You wouldn't even know we had a major snowstorm unless you went to a place that the snow removal doesn't cover, like a park. The city was cleared just in time for another snowfall, but this time a more normal quantity that the city is used to handling. Talking about winter cycling on this channel has always felt like a balancing act. On one hand, busting myths and explaining to car-brained Canadians and Americans that biking in the winter can be practical and even pleasant most of the time if you and your city care to try. I biked literally every single day last winter that we were home in Montreal and only had trouble on maybe half a dozen days. On the other hand, we've had to explain to people from milder, often continental European climates who don't know what all the fuss is about, just put on gloves or something, that winter really can be a big deal here. This applies to all ways of getting around, including driving, but cycling is still something of a novelty, so people and cities are still figuring it out. For a cyclist, that might mean getting studded tires and a bike lock that's practical to use when it's -20. For cities, this means learning how to maintain a different kind of infrastructure, which can include buying different types of equipment and learning different techniques and lessons. And sometimes even a city that's pretty good at managing snow, the snowblower was actually invented here in Montreal in 1925, can get overwhelmed in exceptional weather like the double snowstorm that we got last month. You can quibble with some of the city's choices, but I don't see any way that approaching a meter of snow in 4 days would not be majorly disruptive. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. If your city was in the path of that same snowstorm, let us know in the comments how it went where you live.